Hello, welcome to an overview of the Special Education Indicators. The U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, developed 18 indicators to help each state measure and report on its efforts to educate students with disabilities.
All states and territories submit various data and reports to the U.S. Department of Education. Each state reports on its performance on each of the indicators as well as its plan to make progress in the State Performance Plan and Annual Performance Report, SPP APR. The APR must be submitted annually. In today's module, we will be discussing an overview of Indicator 9, Disproportionate Representation in Special Education. Indicator 9 is part of the SPP APR. What is Indicator 9? Indicator 9 is a compliance indicator, meaning that the indicator's target is 0% or 100%, and this target is set by the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP. OSEP has set Indicator 9's compliance target to 0%. Indicator 9 covers the overall disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups identified as eligible for special education and related services that is a result of an inappropriate identification. Data collection. The Office of Special Education and Early Learning, OSEEL, collects Indicator 9 data through LEA-provided information as self-reported in Infinite Campus, IC, via the December 1 child count. The OSEEL then compares the number of the students with disabilities in each district with a data set on December 1 of the reporting year. Once the child count data are complete and verified, LEA level identification data by each of the 7 racial and ethnic groups is reviewed to determine if disproportionate representation exists. For districts identified as having a disproportionate representation, the state reviews policies, procedures, and practices for appropriate identification of students with disabilities. The state also reviews student records in each of the racial and ethnic groups identified with a disproportionate representation. The OSEEL uses this review to determine if the disproportionate representation identified was due to inappropriate policies, procedure, or practice. The OSEEL uses risk ratio methodology to determine if disproportionate representation exists in LEAs. The risk ratio methodology identifies LEAs who have disproportionate representation in the identification of students in particular racial and ethnic groups. For Indicator 9, OSEEL applies this methodology to determine if disproportionate representation by race and ethnicity exists when identifying students for special education services. Annually, the OSEEL uses risk ratio methodology to determine if disproportionate representation exists in LEAs. In applying this methodology, the OSEEL reviews each LEA's data to ensure for each race and ethnicity examined, the following conditions exist. 1. There were at least 30 students in the racial and ethnic group examined who were enrolled in the LEA. 2. There were at least 10 students in the racial and ethnic group being examined who were identified as eligible for special education services. 3. The rate at which students in the racial and ethnic group being examined meet or exceed the threshold of 2.25 times or greater than the rate of students in all other races who are identified. Frequently asked question. Question. If an LEA is identified for having a specific racial and ethnic category this year, could an LEA be identified for having the same category next year? Answer. LEAs will be identified annually if their risk ratio is 2.25 or greater and the review of policies, procedures, and practices is found to be inappropriate. When an LEA meets the risk ratio requirements for identification for Indicator 9, the OSEEL will complete a desk review to determine if the LEA is correctly identifying students in the identified racial and ethnic category. In summary, Indicator 9 measures disproportionate representation in special education. When a district is identified as being disproportionate, there will be a review of policies, procedures, and practices to determine whether the disproportionate representation was due to inappropriate identification. Here are additional resources for your review. Thank you for viewing this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to access the SPP Indicator Guide on the Special Education Data Dashboard webpage, or you may contact the Division of IDEA Monitoring and Results in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning.